Good afternoon, 6th grade. It is Thursday, April 23rd. We are continuing on in our history and geography class. So we're going to be on pages 300 to 307, a pretty good lengthy reading. And I'll let you know if there's a section on this one that I don't read. I want to read as much of it as I can, but if there's anything that's in those gray boxes, I probably won't read it and I'll leave it up to you to read. So we're going to start, and at the end on page 307, you're going to have Comp Check 16E questions 1 through 5. Make sure you do those, please. Guys, I've gotten back that some of y'all have not been doing your work. Guys, these daily assignments count for you, so if you don't do them, they count against you. So please do your work. I know most of you are. There's a few that I'm aware of that have not been doing their work. Please do so. It helps us out, and that way it lets me know that you're actually either listening or reading along, because that way you can answer the questions. So let's begin. We're going to be looking at Cuba, country under communist dictatorship. Cuba, the largest island in the West Indies, and it's about the size of the state of Pennsylvania, is located only 19 miles south of Key West, Florida. Havana is the nation's capital and largest city. This city has a rich cultural heritage, as seen by the Spanish customs and architecture that still linger there. Cuba includes over 1,000 smaller islands. I didn't even know that. That's kind of cool. When you think Cuba, you think of that one large island, but there's 1,000 smaller islands that include Cuba also. Most Cubans live on the main island, although a few live on the Isle of Youth, formerly known as the Isle of Pines. About 3/4 of the Cubans are Spanish. Others are black or mulatto. Now, I've said mulatto a lot. What mulatto is it's basically it's a mixed race. It's a combination of either Spanish and black or white and black, and they just call them mulatto. I know I've said that word several times. Some of you may be confused as to what that is. That is what mulatto means. Let's see here. Got that part. The official language is Spanish. Among other things, Cuba is known as the home of the bee hummingbird, the smallest bird in the world. It has a wingspan of only about an inch, and its nest is the size of a half of a walnut shell, very tiny little animal. Cuba is probably best known, however, as home of the first communist government in the Western Hemisphere. From colony to nation, we're going to learn about the history of this little island. Columbus discovered Cuba and claimed the island for Spain on his first voyage to the New World. Within 20 years, Spanish settlers were farming the island's fertile soil. Soon, Cuba was one of the wealthiest colonies in the West Indies. The desire for independence increased among the Cubans, and several revolts were attempted against Spain. The United States offered to buy the island, but Spain refused to sell. Finally, with help from the U.S., the Cubans won independence from Spain in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. For a while, the United States government ruled the island. In the early 1900s, the United States allowed Cuba to form its own government under American supervision. The new republic suffered several uprisings in the following years until a revolution in the early 1930s established a dictatorship under Fulgencio Batista. The United States eventually supported Batista and retained only one important naval base at Guantanamo Bay, the coming of communism. In 1959, Fidel Castro, backed by the Soviet Union, overthrew Batista's dictatorship. And the way that he did that is he pretended like he was going to be a kind man overthrowing this cruel dictatorship. But as soon as Batista's regime was thrown out, the people realized that Fidel was no better than Batista. Castro told the Cubans that he'd only wanted to make them free. They soon found out, though, that he was not telling the truth. Instead of giving the people a free government, Castro set up a communist government with himself as the ruler. He called himself prime minister and later president, but in reality he was a dictator far more cruel than the man from whom he had supposedly delivered the people. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans left their land to escape the terror of communism. Most fled to the United States, but others went to Spain, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. These intelligent, hard-working people did well in their new lands and enriched the countries to which they fled. Many became medical doctors. Why did so many Cubans leave their lovely tropical island home? They left because of the terrible living conditions that communism brings and the repression of liberty that always results from communist rule. Many Christians and church leaders fled Cuba in 1961, the year that Castro openly declared his country to be communist. They knew that communism always brings religious persecution because communists are atheists, people who do not believe in God. They cannot tolerate Christianity. Castro allowed a few churches in Cuba to stay open, but few people went to church anymore because they knew that they would be fired from their jobs or persecuted in other ways if they did. Christmas celebrations were outlawed, and most signs of spiritual life disappeared. Our people do not care for religion, boasted the communist bosses. We are materialistic. Cuban children were put into boarding schools. From kindergarten and up, they were taught atheism and other false ideas in their schools and clubs. Communist teachers encouraged the children to spy on their parents and taught them that Cuba must fight to spread communism around the world. Living in confinement. Communism also brings no freedom. Communist revolutions are called liberation movements by their leaders, and liberation means freedom, but communism does not bring freedom. It simply takes freedom away. When Castro took over Cuba, he took away many freedoms, including freedom of the press, the right to a trial by jury, the right to own private property, the right to make a profit, the right to vote, and the right to fair treatment and freedom from unfair trials. Communism always rules by force and fear. Once Fidel Castro gained power, there were no more real elections in Cuba. He chose all of the leaders and ruled the country by a system of fear and suppression. Castro sent Cuban leaders to Russia and Czechoslovakia to learn how to keep people under control in a communist state. They learned so well that Cuba has been called a big dark jail. Specially trained Cubans in every city and village watched their neighbors closely and reported any suspicious activity to the government. The secret police also watched everyone's actions and dealt harshly with anyone whom they suspected of disagreeing with Castro. Over 5,000 people were shot to death for not accepting communism, and many more were cruelly beaten in public. To live in Cuba is to live in fear, the people said. At least 20,000 people were put in Cuban jails for disagreeing with the communist rule. These political prisoners were given long sentences, sometimes 10, 20, or even 30 years. Sometimes when they finished serving one sentence, they were immediately given another. The prisoners were forced to work 70 or 80 hours a week, and many were even tortured to death. Others died because they were denied medical aid, and some were experimented on by communist doctors. Many prisoners developed terrible diseases because of deplorable conditions, lack of wholesome food, and cruel beatings. The communist government in Cuba took over all industries, banks, and small businesses. Everyone in Cuba had a job, but that did not mean that everyone worked. Under a communist system, everyone gets paid whether he works hard or not. Because the Cubans were not rewarded for their good work, they spent much of their time just simply trying to avoid the harsh punishments given by the Communist Party bosses. And I'm not going to read this top part here about Hubert Matas on page 303. Make sure you read that. People usually work hard if they know they will profit from their work. Communism, however, causes people to become lazy and dishonest. They feel that the only way they can show that they do not accept communism is by not caring how well or how fast they do a job. Many people are absent from work or late to work, and it didn't matter. They got paid the same anyway. Even Castro eventually had to admit that Cuban workers had become lazy and undisciplined. He complained that they were more enthusiastic about serving in Angola or Ethiopia than in doing a day's work at home. One Cuban explained the reason. "We are willing to go to Africa because you can accomplish something overseas. At home, the communist system frustrates us." The young people suffered especially because they never learned the habit of honest work. They had schooling, clothing, and medical care provided. Thus, they saw no need to work for anything. Some young people became so bored with this lazy life that they committed suicide. Others turned to alcohol, drugs, or robbery. And another thing about communist regimes is often there's a lack of food. And what you would think would happen in Cuba, a country with rich farmland. Blessed with rich farmland and a warm, moist climate, Cuba had always produced fine crops of sugarcane, pineapples, rice, citrus fruits, and vegetables. Under communism, however, Cuba suffered serious crop failures. This happened in any country ruled by communism. The government takes over almost all private farmland and forces the people to work for the state. Once again, though, without the incentive of personal profit, The farmers produced far less than they did when they were free. Food in Cuba had to be rationed, meaning that people were given a daily fixed amount of food. They could have only the small amount of food the government allowed and no more. Many times these rations even ran out. People sometimes had to spend 2 hours a day standing in long lines in grocery stores where the shelves were almost empty except for a few basic items. Children over 7 were not allowed any milk to drink, and sometimes there was no milk for the babies. To keep them from starving, the people bought food from the black market, an illegal underground system for the exchange of goods developed to avoid government regulation. Communism also caused a severe housing shortage in Cuba. According to communist teaching, people should not be allowed to buy houses. They must live in apartments owned by the government. 2 or more families often had to live in the same small apartment. A family of 4 might have a tiny living room with a refrigerator and a table and chairs, a curtained-off cooking area, a tiny patio for washing and hanging clothes, and a bedroom with just enough room for a double bed for the parents and a bunk bed for the children, and one dresser for the whole family. Because of the housing shortage, the family might have to share these tiny quarters with a whole other family. Whatever the Cubans needed, food, medical care, mail delivery, clothing, housing repairs, permission to travel to the next town, everything had to be approved by the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. If these communist committees did not like a person, they could simply refuse to give him his needs, thus forcing all but the very strongest to bow to communism. The common people in Cuba had to wait in line for everything. Few of them owned automobiles, and they sometimes had to wait 4 hours a day for buses to take them to work and back. Even after long waits for goods, sometimes there were no goods to get. Gasoline and clothing were also rationed, and books were not allowed unless they agreed with communist teachings. Because of the communist system, few new things were manufactured after Castro took over. Almost everything, cars, clothing, appliances, school materials, medical equipment, was all old and shabby. The communist system was supposed to treat everyone as equals. In actuality, about 1/5 of the people were treated far, far better than the rest. Such inequality has been the case in all countries that have been ruled by communism. The Communist Party bosses people in high ranks in the armed forces, business managers, and students who were training to be communist leaders made up this privileged class. They lived in luxury compared to the common people. They were treated to expensive clothing, plush vacation retreats, homes with private swimming pools, and the very best of food. Unlike other Cubans, they were allowed to travel to other countries, and they were among the few who owned automobiles. Because so few things were available in the stores for the common Cubans, stealing became widespread. To escape punishment, thieves bribed the police, and many robberies took place in the neighborhoods of the privileged class. Since the people had largely abandoned all religious principles, they simply took the things that they could not get any other way. The officials also worried that the widespread alcoholism that had plagued other communist countries would infest Cuba. Castro called the Cubans who left their island for a better life in free countries gusanos, or worms. When some of these exiles were allowed to return to Cuba for a short visit with their relatives, however, the Cuban people called them gusanos de sada, or silkworms. Castro had been telling the Cubans who stayed behind, those who fled to the U.S. were trodden underfoot and kept in poverty by the Americans. But when these people returned for visits, it was obvious to all that they were living like rich people in America in comparison to Cuban standards. The exiles had better clothes, far more freedom than anyone who had stayed in Cuba. Soon the Cubans were saying that the gusanos had been transformed into mariposas, or butterflies. The Cuban communist government is not for the people, they lamented. The revolution brought us nothing but misery and fear. Now, on page 306, 307, where it says a study and contrast between free and communist countries, this is a big chart showing you the differences in what's allowed and what's not allowed in communist and free countries. So make sure you read that on your own time. Now I'm going to pick it up here on 307 again. By 1981, the Cubans had become so discontented with the communist way of life that Castro allowed some capitalist ideas to return to the island. He had to do this in order to prevent the whole island from sliding off into the sea of poverty. One official stated, "For 20 years we made the mistake of rejecting everything capitalistic. Now we know that people won't work hard unless they have some incentive. Imagine that. Cuban officials were realizing what all thinking people knew. Communism never works for the betterment of the people. Had Castro really given up on communism? Not at all. In the years to follow, Castro continually took away opportunities that had been given to the people. However, in July of 2006, Fidel Castro's rule of nearly 50 years approached its end. Weakened by a long illness and facing surgery, Fidel gave temporary control to his younger brother Raul. By February of 2008, Raul Castro was given the presidency. Though there appears to have been some lessening of restrictions since Raul comes to power, communism still has, and to this day, still has a firm control over Cuba. And that concludes today's lesson. Please, on page 307, make sure you do comprehension check 16E 1 through 5. Don't worry about 6 and 7. And I will see you guys tomorrow on Friday.